February 2022. Russian armored column, 64 kilometers long. The largest ground invasion in Europe since World War II. It never reached Kyiv, not because of NATO air power, not because of American tanks, because a country with almost no air force took $400 commercial drones, strapped grenades to them, and systematically destroyed the most expensive armored formation on the planet. The Pentagon took notes. So did Beijing. So did Tehran. What they saw in Ukraine didn't just change one war. It made every military doctrine written since 1945 partially obsolete. And the scramble to rewrite those rules is happening right now in every major military on Earth. This video is for educational and analytical purposes based on documented military developments. 6 months before the invasion, he was studying computer science. Now he's in a concrete basement in eastern Ukraine, a tablet screen casting blue light across his face, flying a drone the size of a shoebox toward a Russian T-80 tank worth $3 million. He has no military background, no formal weapons training. What he has is 4,000 hours flying FPV racing drones through obstacle courses and a $400 machine assembled 2 streets away by people who learned their craft on YouTube. He guides the drone into the tank's hatch at 120 kilometers per hour. The T-80 burns for 11 seconds. He reaches for another controller. The scene, or something close to it, repeated thousands of times across the Ukrainian front between 2022 and 2024. And each repetition drove the same question deeper into the planning cells of every major military on Earth. What happens when the cheapest weapon on the battlefield consistently defeats the most expensive one? For most of the 20th century, the question had an obvious answer. Expensive systems win. Control the sky with advanced aircraft, dominate the ground with armored formations, and victory follows. That belief shaped everything: budget allocations, unit structures, the design of bases and logistics networks, the entire architecture of how modern militaries fight. Ukraine didn't challenge that assumption. It destroyed it publicly, on camera, and uploaded the footage within hours. By the end of 2023, open-source battlefield analysis confirmed what Western intelligence had been saying privately for months. Drone-delivered munitions had become responsible for a disproportionate share of Russian armor and personnel losses. Not Javelin missiles, not artillery. Drones assembled in garages by people with no prior military experience. The US Army, NATO planning staffs, the Chinese PLA, and the Israeli Defense Forces all reached the same conclusion at roughly the same time. The rules had changed, not incrementally, but fundamentally. Every doctrine built over the previous 40 years now had a question mark attached to it. The 20-year-old in the basement didn't set out to create that problem. He just needed to stop a column moving toward his city. He stopped it, and the world has been dealing with the consequences ever since. To understand why this happened, you have to understand the specific chain of failures that made it possible. Because the drone itself was not the revolution. The drone had existed for years. What changed was the moment cost stopped being a barrier. In 2015, a military-grade precision drone cost upward of $100,000. Operators required months of specialized training. The systems were fragile, dependent on satellite links, and restricted to forces with the budget and infrastructure to support them. Effective drone warfare, in other words, was the exclusive domain of the United States and a handful of allies. Then 2 things happened simultaneously. Consumer drone technology, driven entirely by the commercial market, by photographers and hobbyists and delivery startups, pushed the cost of capable aerial platforms below $500. At the same time, FPV racing drone culture created an entire generation of operators who could fly at high speed through complex environments with reflexes trained not in military simulators, but in competitive racing circuits. The 20-year-old in the basement was the product of exactly that convergence. He didn't need military training because his training had already happened. In racing leagues, in online communities, in thousands of hours of flight time that no army had paid for and no doctrine had anticipated. Ukraine fused those two developments into a weapons program. But the result wasn't just a cheaper weapon. It was a cheaper weapon that exposed something catastrophic about how modern militaries had been built. Every expensive system in a conventional force, the tanks, the helicopters, the radar installations, the logistics convoys, had been designed with specific threat categories in mind. Missiles, aircraft, artillery. None of them had been hardened against a $400 device guided by a 20-year-old 3 kilometers away. That gap between the threat that existed and the threat that Doctrine had prepared for is what the drone war exploited, not with a single decisive strike, with thousands of them every day, faster than any institution could adapt. Here is the detail that most analysis of this conflict misses. That gap wasn't unique to Russia. It existed in every military. Russia just discovered it under live fire while everyone else discovered it watching the footage. That distinction determined everything that happened next. If you want to keep following this breakdown, subscribe to Operation Fury. We deploy combat analysis in military scenarios every week. Start with Russia, because Russia's response is the most instructive and the most brutal to analyze honestly. Russia entered Ukraine with what it believed was a generational military advantage: modern armor, sophisticated air defense, electronic warfare systems developed specifically to contest American capabilities. Russian commanders expected a 72-hour operation against a force they had wargamed and dismissed. What they had not wargamed was the 20-year-old in the basement, or the 10,000 others exactly like him. In the opening months, Russian soldiers at the unit level had almost no drone awareness training. Officers who had spent careers in an army organized around combined arms doctrine, tanks and artillery and infantry working in coordinated formations, had no answer for an enemy that could see their positions in real time, call fire corrections within minutes, and deliver munitions from directions and altitudes their air defense wasn't designed to cover. The adaptation came. By 2024, Russia had deployed Lancet loitering munitions with real effectiveness against Ukrainian artillery. The Shahed-136, the Iranian-designed kamikaze drone used in mass infrastructure strikes, demonstrated that volume could overwhelm even well-organized air defense. Russian electronic warfare, repositioned to lower echelons, began disrupting Ukrainian drone operations across sections of the front. But the adaptation cost Russia something it couldn't recover: 18 months of battlefield initiative. For 18 months, Ukrainian drone operators dictated the tempo of the ground war. That is not a tactical footnote. That is the entire lesson. Now look at the United States, and the lesson here is more uncomfortable because the American military was watching all of this from a position of supposed advantage and still could not move fast enough. The 20-year-old in the basement was, in many ways, a direct product of the American commercial technology ecosystem. DJI drones, open-source software, FPV racing culture born partly from American hobbyist communities. The United States had built every component of the revolution without building the doctrine to use it. The Pentagon's response, the Replicator Initiative, announced in 2023, targeting thousands of small autonomous systems within 18 to 24 months, was an explicit admission that the existing procurement system couldn't keep pace. The US military procurement cycle is designed for decade-long programs. Ukraine's drone ecosystem evolved on a 6-month cycle. That gap is not a technology problem, it is a cultural one, and cultural problems don't get solved by announcements. China watched both of these responses and drew a different conclusion than either. The 20-year-old in the basement is, from Beijing's perspective, a preview of the Taiwan Strait, a contested littoral environment, drone swarms operating over water and coastline, a defending force using cheap expendable weapons to attrit an advancing force with far more expensive assets. China is not trying to replicate the Ukrainian model. It is trying to build a system that defeats it, while simultaneously developing the offensive capability to use it. The PLA's investments run in both directions at once: long-range loitering munitions and carrier-based uncrewed systems on the offense, anti-swarm defense architectures on the denial side. That combination, building both the sword and the shield simultaneously, is the most strategically significant military development of the last 3 years, and it is happening largely out of public view, in production facilities and testing ranges that don't produce footage for Telegram. The 20-year-old in the basement changed the war he was fighting. China is preparing for the war that comes after the lesson is fully absorbed. Those are two very different levels of response. There is one data point from the Ukraine conflict that has not received the attention it deserves. One comparison that reframes everything else in this breakdown. The F-35 production line, the most advanced fighter aircraft manufacturing program in human history, produces approximately 150 aircraft per year. In a single month in 2024, Ukraine produced over 150,000 FPV drones. Let that land for a moment. 1 month, 150,000 units. A country under active invasion, with a wartime economy and a bombed infrastructure, outproducing the premier weapons program of the most powerful military on Earth by a factor of 1,000 in 30 days. This is not an argument that FPV drones are better than F-35s. They are not. It is an argument that the entire framework for measuring military production capacity and what that capacity means for the outcome of a sustained conflict has to be rebuilt from the ground up. The force that can replace what it loses faster than the enemy can destroy it maintains initiative. Ukraine proved that this threshold could be crossed by a non-superpower using commercial components, software engineers, and decentralized manufacturing spread across dozens of small workshops rather than a single vulnerable factory. The strategic implication is direct. The next major conflict will be won or lost, partly on production floors, not just front lines. And that reality has not been fully absorbed into the force planning of any Western military. The production rupture leads immediately to the second consequence, because once you accept that cheap, expendable systems can be manufactured at this scale, the calculus around large, expensive platforms changes permanently. Aircraft carriers, armored formations massed for assault, fixed air bases, forward logistics hubs. These were built in an era when threatening them required assets that could themselves be detected and intercepted. The cost of the attack was high enough to constrain when and how it could happen. A swarm of 300 low-cost autonomous systems does not work that way. The USS Gerald R. Ford cost $13 billion to build and $7 million per day to operate. A coordinated swarm attack using several hundred systems, assembled from commercially available components, represents a threat category for which no mature, scalable defense currently exists at the necessary density. Every Navy staff in the world is running that calculation. The math does not resolve cleanly for anyone. These two ruptures, production volume and platform vulnerability, are not separate problems. They are the same problem viewed from different angles. Both come from the same root: the assumption that expensive systems would always be protected by the cost of attacking them. Ukraine proved that assumption was wrong. The 150,000 drones in a single month are the proof. The Gerald Ford calculation is the consequence. Here's the question worth thinking about. Which military do you believe is genuinely closest to solving the drone defense problem? The US, China, or Israel? Drop your answer in the comments. Every defense ministry on Earth, not just the 3 covered in this breakdown, but India, South Korea, Turkey, Australia, every nation with a serious military institution, is now working through the same 2 ruptures simultaneously. The doctrinal response is global, even when the public attention is not. The 20-year-old in the basement created a problem that no single country and no single solution is going to resolve alone. In 2026, every major military is operating under a provisional doctrine, not a finished one, a working draft, explicitly designed to be revised within 18 months. because the technology is moving faster than any institutional cycle can absorb. That admission, from institutions that typically measure doctrine development in decades, tells you everything about the scale of what happened. The sensor layer has to be rebuilt first. Radar systems designed to track fast jets and ballistic missiles are largely ineffective against slow, small, low-altitude drones. Detecting the actual threat, not the threat from 40 years of Cold War planning, requires a different architecture at every level from strategic command down to the infantry platoon. That rebuild is underway. It is years from complete. The problem cascades from there. Once you can detect the drone, you have to stop it at a cost that doesn't bankrupt you faster than your enemy can build more. Electronic warfare jamming, directed energy lasers, interceptor drones that kill attacking drones below the cost threshold of the swarm. These are the active research priorities of every defense establishment with the budget to pursue them. The United States, Israel, and the United Kingdom are furthest along. None have a complete answer at scale, and because drone operations depend on GPS, every force in a contested environment has to assume GPS will be taken away. Russia demonstrated this across large sections of the Ukrainian front. Weapons, vehicles, communications, anything built around satellite navigation becomes a vulnerability the moment an adversary with a jamming system shows up. Fixing that is not a software update. It is years of retrofits across entire fleets. Underlying all of it is the production question, the 150,000 drones question. The number of systems a military can manufacture per month is now as operationally significant as the size of its armored fleet. Building that capacity requires a relationship between defense ministries and industrial policy that most Western militaries do not currently have. And then there is the human cost that no doctrine anticipated. The 20-year-old in the basement did not come out of this war unchanged. FPV drone operators, flying first-person view into armored vehicles, watching the impact at high resolution through their goggles, report trauma rates consistent with direct infantry combat. The intimacy of the kill, experienced through a screen, is not psychological distance. It is a different kind of proximity, one that military medicine had no framework to treat before 2022. An entire generation of veterans is carrying that experience. The psychological cost of this war is still being calculated. What is already clear is that the assumption of clean, remote, low-trauma drone warfare was wrong. Any doctrine that builds for sustainability on that assumption is building on false ground. The 20-year-old in the basement didn't set out to rewrite military history. He set out to stop a column moving toward his city. He stopped it, and in doing so, exposed a gap that existed not just in the Russian military, but in every military on Earth. A gap between the threats doctrine was built to defeat and the threat that actually showed up. A gap between production cycles measured in decades and a battlefield that evolved in months. A gap between the assumption of remote, clean warfare and the reality of what it costs the people who fight it. That gap is still being closed. The doctrine is still being written. And the next theater where these capabilities collide, different terrain, different adversary, higher stakes, will be the real test of whether the lessons of Ukraine were absorbed in time or only studied in retrospect. That scenario is coming next on Operation Fury. Subscribe to Operation Fury and hit the bell. You don't want to miss what happens when this doctrine meets its first real test outside Ukraine. See you on the next operation.